That morning began like any other in the quiet village. But by noon, little Kofi's world had already cracked in two. He was only 8, still small enough to believe that home meant safety. But that day, safety shattered right before his eyes. When he pushed open the kitchen door, the smell of cooked beans still lingered in the air. Yet all he saw was his mother, Abina, lying on the hard floor, her face bleeding, her hands trembling, her eyes lost between pain and shame. For a long heartbeat, Kofi just stood there frozen. Then, before he could run or call for help, he heard the heavy footsteps behind him. Mensa, his father, stood there, chest rising with rage, his breath thick with drink. But the worst blow didn't come from his fists. It came from his voice. "She just fell," he said sharply, glaring at his son. "Your mother's clumsy." His tone was ice, his stare colder. And as Abena groaned softly, trying to move, Mensa's hand landed heavy on Kofi's shoulder. "You hear me, boy? Not a word of this leaves the house." That moment branded itself into Kofi's heart. Because inside a child's chest, secrets don't disappear. They turn into scars. They grow into questions, into fire, into courage. And one day, when that courage finally broke loose, it wouldn't be just a child speaking. It would be the fall of an abuser before everyone. But back then, silence ruled that home. The floor still carried the dried stains of her blood. The wooden walls whispered the truth the family was forced to deny. Even the wind that slipped through the cracks seemed afraid to make a sound. Kofi wanted to scream, to tell the neighbors that his mother hadn't tripped, that her bruises weren't from a fall, that her pain had a name. His father's. But before he could breathe a word, Mensa's cold voice chained him. "Come here," his father said. "Listen, boy." The man's tone was low, like thunder waiting to strike. "What happened here doesn't leave this door. Anyone who opens their mouth will learn to stay silent through pain." Kofi's stomach twisted. His mother tried to speak, but her voice came out broken, trembling. Mensa didn't care. He turned away, muttering again. "It was a fall. You understand? A fall." That lie dropped in the room like a heavy stone, and all three of them were forced to carry it in their chests. Abina nodded weakly. Not because she believed him, but because survival often wore the mask of silence. That night, Kofi curled in the dark corner of his small room, his body shaking. His head was full of questions no one would answer. Why did no one defend her? Why pretend nothing happened? But even his thoughts felt dangerous. It was as if the air in that house could listen. Days passed, crueler than before. Abina wrapped her scarf tighter every morning, hiding the marks with trembling hands. At the well, when women asked, "Are you all right?" she forced a smile and said, "I tripped, that's all." The lie became her shadow, and Kofi, still too young to grasp the twisted world of adults, learned what silence truly meant. A prison with no walls. Every time his father's words echoed in his head, it felt like someone was pulling his voice out of him. He wanted to speak up, to protect his mother, but fear was stronger. Fear of another beating. Fear of making her suffer more. At night, he would wake up to the sound of muffled crying from the kitchen. He'd lie still, staring at the ceiling, torn between rushing to her side or pretending to sleep. In those moments, silence became his cruel companion, a monster that sat beside them at breakfast. Mensa would chew slowly, pretending all was normal, asking, "Is the corn ready?" while the weight of fear turned every meal into quiet torture. Inside that home, pain had its own routine. Abena woke before sunrise, moving like a ghost through the house. She cleaned, boiled water, fixed Kofi's porridge, then faced the mirror. The bruises stared back at her, purple, fading, but never gone. She tied her scarf higher, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. In the village, the women talked about crops and children. Abena nodded politely, but her silence spoke louder than their chatter. Her body was a book of scars she hid behind practiced grace. Kofi watched it all. He saw her whisper prayers as she pressed a damp cloth to her cheek. "Lord, keep me safe again," she murmured. He couldn't understand why she hid, why shame seemed heavier than hurt. But he learned. He learned that some pain doesn't live on the skin. It lives behind the eyes. Once his mother's gaze had been warm, full of stories and laughter. Now her eyes were distant, searching the ground as if she'd lost the horizon itself. That change hurt Kofi most. Bruises heal, he thought, but a broken gaze takes longer to rise again. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed with uneasy silence. At the table, Mensa ate without lifting his head. Abena served in silence. Kofi chewed slowly, guessing what mood his father was in. Every sudden movement made him flinch. It wasn't just fear. It was routine submission. the habit of swallowing both food and feelings. Outside, whispers began to spread. Nana Awa, the elder neighbor, said one day, "Abena, your eyes speak more than your mouth." "You're not the same," Abena smiled faintly. "I'm only tired, my sister. Just tired." But her tiredness was a disguise, and behind that smile hid a silent cry for help. The cruelest part was how Abena began to believe the lies herself. That endurance was love, that silence was protection. Between prayer and forced smiles, she built invisible walls around her heart. And though Kofi was still a child, he felt every brick of that wall pressing against him. He grew up learning that truth had no place in their home. Pain was swept under the rug, hidden like dust that never really left. The bruises on his mother's skin were the same wounds carved into his soul. He learned to read the quiet, the shaking hands, the covered faces, the slow steps. He learned that the deepest wounds don't bleed, but he also learned that nothing truly stays buried. Some truths grow stronger in silence, and someday he knew those marks would speak louder than any lie. Little by little, the house stopped being a home. Once, neighbors came freely, sharing food, stories, and laughter by the fire. Nana Awa often brought fruit for Kofi, smiling as she entered. But one day Mensa stopped her at the gate. "Not today," he said firmly. "Abena needs to rest." His voice left no space for argument. Nana Awa handed the fruit to Kofi, her smile fading, and walked away without a word. After that, visits became rare. Conversations died. The laughter that once filled the yard disappeared. The house, already heavy with pain, turned into a place of loneliness too. Abena, who once loved to talk and listen, now sat by the doorway staring at the world outside, but never stepping into it. It was as if an invisible boundary had been drawn, one she could no longer cross. Mensa's silent threats became the new walls of their home. Each time someone tried to get close, he had another excuse ready. "She's sick. She can't have visitors. We're busy. Not today." And with every excuse, another door closed, until all that remained inside was silence, and all that ruled that silence was fear. Gradually, no one asked anymore. The village, though suspicious, respected the distance. For Kofi, it was like losing the last bit of refuge he had left. Before, there were the laughs of other children, the hugs of aunties, the sweet voice of Nana Ajoa telling him old proverbs. Now everything was silence and walls. The boy felt trapped inside his own home like a bird with tied wings. At night, the prison became even more suffocating. Abena would put out the oil lamps early as if darkness was some kind of shield. She sat hugging her knees, whispering prayers in a low voice. Kofi would lie next to her, listening to every word. He didn't understand them all, but he knew they were pleased for strength, for protection, for escape. "Lord, don't abandon us. Give me the courage to endure." The boy closed his eyes, and his mother's prayer became his lullaby. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Abena no longer laughed, no longer told stories, no longer sang lullabibis. Silence had stolen her voice, and Mensith, his iron authority, had made sure it stayed that way. Even within the village, whispers began to spread. Some said, "Menser just wants to protect his home." Others, more observant, murmured, "Something's wrong." No one shuts their doors for no reason. But no one dared confront him. For Kofi, each of his father's actions was a reminder of powerlessness. He watched his mother slowly lose her connection to the world, like a tree surrounded by stones, unable to grow, and the anger inside him grew. Tangled with fear, a child couldn't face a man like Mensa, but a child's heart refuses to stay silent forever. One day, Kofi took a piece of charcoal and drew on the bedroom wall. He sketched a simple image, a woman with tears, a man with raised fists, and in the middle, a child with arms open. It was his way of screaming without words, of saying what couldn't be said aloud. When Abena saw the drawing, she just held him tightly and cried. No words were needed. They both understood what it meant. The cruel isolation wasn't just men's strategy to hide his actions. It was also a way to hold power. The fewer people who entered that house, the more his version of thestry held up. It was just a fall he repeated whenever someone dared to ask. But every silence, every closed door, every averted gaze was a confession louder than any words. And so within walls that no longer echoed with friendly voices, mother and son learned to endure alone. Abena, with her quiet faith, Kofi, with his growing revolt. The isolation meant to bury the truth only made it heavier, more unbearable. Ready one day to be revealed before everyone. Time passed, but Kofi's memories didn't fade. The silence of the house grew heavier by the day, suffocating his childhood and turning the boy into the keeper of a secret that burned inside him. He watched his mother hide behind scarves, forced smiles, and vague answers, and he watched his father keep control with threatening looks, as if every gesture said, "Don't you dare speak." But Kofi couldn't bear it anymore. It was as if the lie had grown roots inside him, sprouting thorns. He felt that if he didn't open his mouth, he would be crushed by the weight of the truth. Even though he was afraid, something greater rose within him. The urge to protect his mother, to cry out for justice. It was on a market morning that his courage found its path. Abena had insisted on walking him to the road, but Kofi asked her to stay home. He went alone, a small basket in his arms, crossing the red dust road that led to the village. His heart was pounding. He already knew who he was looking for. Of all people, there was one he trusted. Nana Ajoa, the elderly neighbor, known for her kindness and her firm tongue whenever she saw injustice. She had always had a consoling word for Abena, even when Mensa pushed her away, and Kofi knew that if anyone would listen to him, it would be her. He found her near the tomato stall, arranging the produce she was selling. He approached slowly, his eyes full of restrained tears. The woman greeted him with warmth. "Kofi, my son, what happened? Why such a heavy face?" He hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Then in a trembling whisper he murmured, "It wasn't a fall, Nana. It wasn't a trip. It was him. It was my father who hit her." Nana's wrinkled hands froze in midair. The silence between them weighed more than any words. She crouched down to meet the boy's eyes and gently wiped away the tears that had begun to flow. "My son, I knew something was wrong, but to hear it from your mouth, may God give you strength." Kofi felt an immediate relief, as if he had finally dropped the stone he'd been carrying in his chest. But the relief didn't last, because that same day, the rumor began to spread through the village. The words moved like wind, slipping under doors, reaching attentive and curious ears. Some reacted with disbelief, murmuring, "Mensa! Impossible! He's always been respected." Others, however, remembered Abena's downcast look and simply nodded in silence. When Abena learned that the truth was already circulating, her heart raced. At first she felt fear. Fear of her husband's fury, fear of public shame, fear of losing even the little she had left. But soon she realized something new. The lie was no longer buried. That secret which had suffocated her for so long was beginning to seethe light. That night, as she embraced her son, she asked, "Was it you, Kofi? Were you the one who spoke to Nana?" The boy, eyes downcast, replied, "Yes, mother. I couldn't keep it anymore. I don't want to see you suffer in silence." She cried quietly, not out of anger, but out of relief. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. Hurson's courage showed her that truth, even fragile as a whisper, could break through the hardest walls. Meanwhile, Mensa began to notice the different looks on the street. People whispered when he passed. Women stared at him with firmness, and even the men who used to greet him respectfully now lowered their eyes. The power he believed unshakable was beginning to crack, and in that crack, Abena felt a spark of strength awaken. If her son, so small, had found the courage to speak, who was she to remain silent? Perhaps the time was coming to break the silence that had choked her for years. Perhaps the scream she had always swallowed was closer than ever to escaping. Kofi's courage didn't just expose the truth. It awakened in his mother a new vision. The certainty that silence protected no one, but only strengthened the abuser. Without knowing it, the child had lit the flame of resistance that would change everything. The walls of Aben's house felt narrower, ever since the truth had slipped from Kofi's lips. The rumor had spread, and though no one had confronted Mensa directly, the village's silence was no longer the same. He noticed the sidelong glances, the muffled whispers at the market, the distance of the men who once respected him, that wounded him more than any words. Men's pride, once firm as stone, was now splintering under looks heavy with suspicion. It was in that tense atmosphere that his fury found its target in his son. One night, when the lamp had already dimmed and Abena was trying to put Kofi to bed, Mensa stormed into the room with heavy steps. His eyes blazed with fire. His chest heaved like a man carrying a dammed-up hatred. He didn't need to ask anything. The accusation burned in his face. "Was it you, boy?" He roared, his deep voice so loud it made Kofi flinch. "Was it you who dragged my business out of this house? Was it you who filled your mouth with lies and spread them through the whole village?" The boy tried to answer, but fear choked him. Abena, sensing the danger, tried to intervene. "Mensa, listen, please," but he didn't let her finish. He lunged at Kofi, his hand already raised, ready to strike. Not just a physical blow, but a symbolic one meant to crush the voice that had dared to defy his silence. In that instant, Abena made a decision that would forever change the story of that house. Like lightning, she threw herself between her husband and her son, arms spread wide like a human shield. Her eyes, so long lowered before him, now lifted, firm, glistening with tears, but burning with courage. "You can beat me 1,000 times. Mensa, you can leave me bleeding on the floor. but you will not lay a hand on my son." The words thundered through the room. Even Kofi, hiding behind her, stood in awe at the strength of that voice. It was as if a Benefod years smothered by fear had found within her suffering the spark of resistance. Mensa froze for a moment as though he couldn't believe what he heard. He was used to submission, to the lowered voice, to the eyes that always turned away. But now before him stood a different woman, not raised by physical strength, but by the fury of a mother's heart. He still tried to advance, but Abinner did not step back. With a steady voice, she repeated, "You can unleash your rage on me. But don't you dare touch this boy, because if you do, the whole world will know who you truly are." The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts. Kofi felt his mother's breath racing, her body trembling, but she did not move. There was no retreat, no visible fear. For the first time, Abina faced the abuser head-on. Mensa, his pride wounded, stepped back. He muttered insults, struck the mud wall with his fist, but he couldn't bring himself to land the blow. That gesture from Abinner had shattered something inside him. The power he always believed unshakable over his family had begun to crumble not because of the village rumors, but because of the unexpected courage of the woman he thought too fragile to resist. That night the air in the house shifted. There was still fear, still pain, but there was also a new breath of hope. Kofi, huddled in the corner, looked at his mother with admiration. To him, she was no longer just the woman who hid bruises under scarves. She was now the wall that rose against violence. The voice that broke the silence. The warrior who with words stopped the blows of a man consumed by rage. Abina knew she would pay a price for that defiance. She knew Mensa would not easily accept the loss of control, but at the same time, she felt a new certainty inside her. She could never return to the silence of before. If until now she had endured everything in the name of peace, she now understood that silence was what kept the violence alive. And for Kofi, that moment would be unforgettable. He had not only seen his mother protect him, he had seen her break the invisible chains that had kept them prisoners. It was then he understood that courage, even when born in tears, can be stronger than any blow. Men's fury was not over, but that night, before the closed door and the nearly extinguished lamp, the boy discovered he was no longer alone, because his mother, weary and wounded, had found her voice. And that voice would be the weapon that changed both their destinies. That night, after the confrontation, the silence of the house was no longer the same. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves had heard Abina's words and held the echo of her courage. Kofi, still wrapped in his mother's arms, could hardly believe what he had witnessed. For the first time, he had seen Abina rise before Mensignor as a resigned victim, but as a woman determined, refusing to let violence touch her son's life any longer. Mensa, ashamed of his own retreat, spent the following days caught between rage and silence. He paced the house like a shadow, avoiding his wife's eyes, muttering curses and broken phrases, as though trying to reclaim the authority that had slipped away. But what he didn't realize was that Abina's gesture had opened a crack that could never be closed again. Abina woke the next morning with her eyes still heavy, but her heart beating differently. When she looked into the polished metal mirror, she no longer saw only the bruises hidden beneath her scarf. She also saw the strength that had risen inside her the night before. If I could protect my son, I can protect myself, she thought. That conviction, fragile but real, marked the beginning of her liberation. In the days that followed, small gestures revealed the change. When Mensa demanded her silence at mealtimes, she no longer lowered her eyes. She answered him firmly, even if with few words. When he tried to impose his lies before the neighbors, Abina let slip looks and subtle remarks that chipped away at his mask. Kofi watched everything with admiration. To him, his mother seemed like a different person. She was no longer just the woman who hid bruises under colorful scarves, but someone who was slowly learning to use her voice as a shield. One night as they washed dishes together, he whispered, "Mother, when you shouted, 'Not my son,' I felt like nothing could hurt me." She smiled through tears and answered, "It's because words have power, Kofi. There are times when silence kills more than pain." I learned that late, but I learned the community began to notice Abinner's transformation as well. When she went to the well for water, she no longer hid her face as much. She still wore the scarf, but she no longer bent under its weight. Her step, though weary, seemed firmer. The women of the village, used to seeing her withdrawn, began to whisper, "Abina is different. There's something in her eyes we haven't seen in years." Mensa, on the other hand, felt this change as an affront. He tried to reclaim his authority with shouts, but with every firm reply from his wife, he sensed control slipping from his hands. Once when he tried to scold her in front of Kofi, Abina looked him straight in the eye and said, "You may try to silence my mouth, Mensa, But you can no longer silence the truth because my son already knows who you are on. So do I. Those words struck him like an invisible blow. He who had always believed submission to be law now faced an unexpected resistance. It wasn't the strength of fists, but the strength of words, and those words were beginning to erode the very foundation of his tyranny. In her private prayers, Abina began to speak to God differently. She no longer asked only for strength to endure, but for courage to speak. Lord, if you gave me a voice, let it not be lost in silence. Give me courage not to remain quiet before evil. These prayers, simple as they were, became seeds sprouting within her, preparing her for the steps ahead. Kofi, listening to his mother's prayers, felt safer. He realized her faith was no longer just a desperate plea, but also a cry of defiance. He knew danger still lingered, but he now understood they were no longer alone, because his mother's voice, once stifled, now echoed through the house, challenging fear and carrying hope. Habina did not transform overnight. There were still tears, still nights of heavy silence, still fear of what Mensa might do. But one thing was undeniable. She had found her voice, and that voice, even fractured by pain, was proof she would no longer be a prisoner of silence. What had begun as a desperate cry to protect her son was becoming little by little the banner of a woman who had learned to face not only her husband, but also the weight of shame and the fear of rejection. And each word spoken, each gaze held, each firm response was a silent victory against years of oppression. In that home, where once only imposed silence reigned, a new melody was being born. Abina's voice breaking chains, opening paths, preparing to echo beyond the walls of the house until it reached the ears of the entire village. From the day Abina found her voice, the atmosphere inside the house never returned to what it once was. If silence had once ruled as Mensa's law, now the space was filled with clashes, cutting words, looks that crossed like swords. The house, which should have been a refuge, had become a battlefield. Men, long used to being obeyed without question, could not accept his wife's sudden change. The simple act of Abina holding his gaze when he spoke was, to him, an affront. Each time she answered with firmness, even in few words, he felt his authority crumble. The loss of that power consumed him like fire hidden under ashes. The arguments began small, a contradiction at the table, a refusal before an order, an eye that no longer lowered, but soon they grew, swelling into shouts that pierced the walls. The lamps bore witness to long nights where men's voice thundered across the courtyard, followed by Abina's steady replies. Kofi, pressed into a corner, listened with a racing heart and trembling hands, but also with a spark of pride. He saw his mother resisting, and he knew that her courage was also for him. Once Mensa accused her in front of their son. You're disrespecting me, Abin. You're teaching this boy to turn against me. But Abina, her voice unshaken, answered, It isn't me teaching Mensa. He simply sees the truth you try to hide. Her words fell like a stone into the man's chest. He turned, slammed his fist on the table, but he could no longer control the direction the conversation had taken. The war was not only of words, it was also of presence. Mensa tried to reassert his dominance by pushing the neighbors even further away, sealing the house from the outside world with rules and threats. But now Abina no longer bowed as before. In secret, she allowed small acts of resistance. A quick visit accepted, a short conversation at the well, a look exchanged with a neighbor that spoke louder than 1,000 words. Kofi, more aware each day, saw that this war carried no visible weapons, but was instead the force of truth against the weight of fear. And within that battle, he began to understand that courage was not measured by the loudness of shouts, but by the ability to hold on to truth, haven, when it cost dearly. The walls of the house, once accomplices of silence, now became witnesses to tense dialogues. When neighbors passed on the street, they could hear the shouting spill past the closed gate. It was no longer possible to hide the conflict. The village, which had once accepted Mensa's excuses, began to sense that something deeper was happening inside that family. On one of those nights, when the confrontation dragged on until dawn, Abina raised her voice before Kofi and declared, I will not live in silence any more, Mensa. The shame is not mine, it's yours. Because a man who raises his hand against his wife deserves no respect. Her words echoed with such power that even the midnight silence seemed to bow before them. Mensa, unsure how to respond, stepped back. His pride would not let him yield, but his wife's courage could no longer be erased. He still tried to assert dominance, still used threats, still spread fear. But Abina had already learned that her word was her weapon, and once found, it could never be buried back in silence. For Kofi, that period was marked by nights of tears and days of tension, but also by a silent lesson. Dignity can be born even in the midst of war. He saw his mother stand tall against his father and knew he was witnessing something larger than a family quarrel. It was a battle between truth and lies, between fear and courage. And so the house that had once been a silent prison became a battlefield. But in that war, with every firm word from Abina, with every act of resistance against threats, there was also born the hope that the end of oppression was drawing near. The arguments inside Abina's house could no longer be contained within those four walls. The words spilled through the open windows, crossed the yard, slid down the village's dirt roads, and reached the attentive ears of the neighbors. What had once been rumor was now evidence. Men's lie, sustained 4 years in silence, began to collapse before the force of the truth, escaping through the cracks. At first, the neighbors pretended not to hear. No one should meddle in a couple's quarrel, they would say. But each night the shouts grew louder, and Abina's replies firmer. It was no longer the voice of a cornered woman, but of someone who had found within herself the courage to resist. And that change did not go unnoticed. One morning, as Abina filled her jars at the well, 2 women approached. They were Asua and a few her childhood friends who had drifted away because of the barriers Mensa had imposed. They hesitated for a moment, then carefully came closer. Abina, Asawa said, looking into her eyes. We heard. We all heard. You don't have to hide anymore. Those words fell like balm upon Abina's heart. For the first time in years, someone acknowledged her pain aloud. She didn't answer right away, but her tear-filled eyes said everything. Then Yua added, You are not alone. We are here. And so the isolation Mensa had built began to crack. What once were closed doors and forced smiles now turned into quiet solidarity. The village women drew nearer, offering small acts of kindness, a brief visit, a new piece of cloth, a plate of food left discreetly at her door. Simple gestures yet full of meaning. Mensa noticed the change. He saw the neighbors' stares when he walked down the street, felt the coldness in their greetings, realized he was no longer seen as the respected man he once was. Each time he raised his voice against a binner, he knew there were ears listening outside. The community was beginning to see him for what he truly was. One night, the quarrel was so fierce that even the village elders heard it. Mensa shouted, but Abina did not remain silent. And in the middle of the fight, her words rang out into the street. You may lie to everyone, Mensa, but I will not carry your lie anymore. I'm not ashamed. The shame is yours. Those words flowed through the village like a river breaking new paths. The women whispered among themselves. She finally spoke. The men muttered, So it's true. And the youth watched insolence, learning that there was strength in the voice of a woman who refused silence any longer. Kofi, sitting in the corner of the room, listened with his heart pounding. He understood something greater was happening. It was not just his mother's fight against his father. It was truth spreading, crossing walls, reaching the community. He knew that every phrase spoken aloud was another crack in the wall of lies his father had built for so many years. In time, Abena began to walk the streets with less fear. She still wore her scarf, but her eyes no longer lowered as before. There was something in her posture that drew attention, her dignity regained, a breath of hope. And the women, inspired by her, began gathering more often, quietly sharing their own pains, finding in Abena a mirror of resistance. The community, which once stayed silent in the face of suspicion, now listened clearly. It was no longer possible to pretend they didn't know. Abena's words, spoken even in the midst of quarrels, were seeds germinating in every attentive heart. And so men's power dwindled, not because someone confronted him with fists, but because the truth found its echo in the voices of the village. The isolation he had imposed turned into exposure. The secret he had tried to bury became public, and for Abena, that change brought a painful relief. There was still suffering, but no longer solitude. She no longer carried alone the shame that was never hers. Now the entire community knew, and that knowing was the first victory against silence. The entire village now knew that something was happening inside Ina's house. The whispers, once timid, had turned into open conversations. Noon believed the excuse of a simple fall anymore, and the shouts that echoed through the night had torn away men's mask. The man once seen as respectable was now crumbling in front of the community like a clay idol breaking under the rain. The elders of the village, guardians of order and tradition, could no longer ignore it. It was time to listen, so they called a meeting in the central square, beneath the great tree that for generations had sheltered decisions of justice and reconciliation. There Abin truth would finally be put to the test. That day men and women gathered, forming a circle around the elders. Children ran nearby, curious, but was soon pushed aside. The air was thick with expectation. Some believed Ina would remain silent as always. Others suspected that this time the truth would finally leave her lips. Mensa arrived first. Heavy steps, his face tense with anger. He sat before the elders, chest puffed, trying to preserve the image of an honorable man. Soon after came Abena with Kofi at her side. The boy gripped his mother's hand tightly, as if lending her his courage. The silence that fell as she approached was dense, almost touchable. The eldest of the council, Nanak, opened the gathering with a grave voice. "We are here because the peace of this village cannot be stained by secrets and lies. Mensa, there are rumors about you. But today, before all, your wife will have the chance to speak, and may her words be like clean water, pure and true." Abena took a deep breath. Her heart raced, but inside her something was stronger than fear. The memory of the night she had shouted to protect her son, and the certainty that she could no longer carry her pain alone. Hurt-filled eyes swept over the circle of faces. Then, her voice trembling, she began. "For many years I endured in silence. I hid bruises under scarves, swallowed tears so as not to frighten my child, invented falls that never happened. I did this because I thought silence would protect me, but it didn't. It only strengthened the hands that hurt me." The crowd remained in absolute silence. Only the wind through the leaves broke the weight of her words. Abena continued. "I stayed quiet out of fear. Fear of shame, fear of judgment, fear of losing even the little I had. But the truth is there is no shame in being hurt. The shame belongs to the one who raises his hand against his wife and his child. I stayed silent for years, but today I will hide no more." At that moment, Kofi squeezed his mother's hand tighter and with a firm voice added, "I saw it. I was there. My mother speaks the truth. I didn't have the courage to tell before, but I couldn't keep it alone any longer." The boy's words fell upon the assembly like lightning. A child's testimony, pure and undeniable, shattered any doubt that remained. The elders exchanged grave looks. Some women discreetly wiped away tears. Mensa tried to react. He leapt to his feet, voice dripping with rage. "Lies. Allies. You've poisoned my son against me," but the people no longer heard him the same way. His fury, once a weapon of fear, now seemed only proof of what they already suspected. Nanakame raised his hand for silence. "Mensa, a child's words are not lies. They are mirrors. And today, this mirror has shown who you truly are." Abena feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. Let her tears flow without shame. They were no longer tears of humiliation, but of liberation. For the first time in many years, she felt seen, heard, believed. Her pain, once locked inside her home, now stood before the whole village, bathed in daylight. The people murmured among themselves. There was no denying it anymore. The truth had been spoken. And before them, Abena was no longer the woman who hid her scars. She was now a symbol of resistance, a voice echoing for all those who had been forced into silence. The revelation before the elders was not just a personal act. It was a collective one, a lesson for everyone present, because from that day on, each would carry the memory that silence protects the abuser. But truth, and painful truth, sets people free. After the revelation before the elders, Mensa's life was never the same. The man who once walked the streets with his chin raised in a commanding voice now felt the weight of the stares that followed him. There were no more respectful greetings, no more invitations to share palm wine or join the village councils, where a false prestige had once reigned. Now there was silence, disapproval, and contempt at the market. When Mensa approached, the women stopped their conversations. The men looked away, and some even stepped aside, as if simple contact with him brought shame for a man who had always fed on the respect of others. That rejection was a harder blow than any word. He who for years had believed he could control everything with threats and silence now discovered that power crumbles in the face of truth. Abena meanwhile walked with a new posture. She still carried the marks of the past on her body and in her soul, but now her voice rose like a banner. The village women greeted her with firmness. Some embraced her discreetly. Others offered helpers if recognizing her as a warrior. Kofi at her side grew with a heart full of pride. He knew his childhood had been scarred by pain, but also shaped by Abin's courage, who had turned tears into dignity. Mensa tried to regain control. Sometimes he raised his voice at home, trying to intimidate again, but the reaction was no longer the same. Abin did not bow. The boy no longer lowered his eyes, and the weight of the community, now watching closely, made every move of his judged. He could no longer strike in silence, no longer shout without neighbors hearing. The prison he had once built for his wife and son had become his own. Mensa's downfall did not come with chains or tribunals, but with dishonor. The man who once prided himself on being called chief in his own house was now pointed out as a coward. At every meeting in the square, at every council gathering, his name carried shame, and inside that humiliation grew like poison, corroding what remained of his pride. The most painful part for him was realizing that Kofi, the son meant to inherit his name and authority, no longer saw him as an example. The boy's gaze, once full of fear, was now steady. It was the gaze of someone who saw not a father to be respected, but the bitter memory of violence. Mensa tried to reclaim that bond with empty promises and harsh words, but it was too late. The boy's heart was bound to his mother's, and no display of arrogance could undo that. Abena, though relieved for having spoken out, did not celebrate her husband's fall with vengeful pride. There was a deep sadness in her, because the man she'd once known, the one who had promised to be her partner and protector, had been lost to his own fury and pride. But she also knew that her resistance had saved not only herself but also Kofi's life. And so, little by little, Menza's figure faded from the respectful memory of the village. From an honored man, he became a symbol of shame. From a feared chief, he was remembered as a coward. His authority dissolved like dust, because no one follows the man who raises his hand against his own. Abena, on the other hand, became an example, not because she had fought with violence, but because she had turned pain into voice, silence into courage, tears into dignity. The women whispered her name as if guarding a secret of strength, and the men, even in silence, recognized that true honor belongs to those who protect, not those who harm. Kofi grew up marked by that story. He carried the scars of childhood, but also the living memory of his mother standing as a shield against his father's fury. That memory became stronger than any lesson. The certainty that true strength is not in fists, but in the courage to face injustice, even when the world seems blind. Thus, Mensa's downfall was not only the defeat of an abuser. It was the victory of a voice that refused to die in silence. And that victory echoed through the village as a warning and a lesson. No power lasts when it rises upon the suffering of others. Sooner or later, truth comes to light, and dignity triumphs over violence. The years went by, but the memory of that morning when Kofi found his mother on the floor never disappeared. The image of Abena, her face marked by violence, her fragile body sustained only by the will to live, remained as a scar in his soul. But over time, that scar ceased to be only pain. It became also a reminder of strength, of resistance, of dignity. Abena did not win with fists, nor with revenge. Her victory was born from the word that broke the silence, from the courage to say enough when everyone expected her to keep quiet. It was in that instant when she shouted before her husband, "Not my son," that history changed, because that phrase was not only defense, it was also a rebirth. Mensa, the man who for years had been feared, ended his days in isolation. He still lived in the village, but he had no voice anymore. No one consulted him. No one respected him. He walked the streets as a shadow of what he once was, carrying the shame of having been unmasked, not by stronger men, but by a woman who refused to die in silence, and by a son who dared to tell the truth. That was his true defeat. Realizing that even while alive, he no longer had a place in anyone's heart. For Abena, victory was not made of wealth or status. It was made of respect, of recognition, of dignity restored. The women of the village came to see her as an example, and many found strength in her courage to also break the silences they carried. She did not become a distant heroine, but a close mirror, showing that even in fragility, there is room for resistance. But Kofi, who had grown up witnessing pain and humiliation, found in his mother's courage the foundation of his character. He became a man of steady word, someone who would not accept injustice in silence. His childhood had not been wasted, because from it was born the determination to be different, to protect instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy. He carried the pride of being the son of the woman who taught with tears and with voice. That dignity is stronger than violence. The village in turn also learned its lesson. It understood that silence strengthens the abuser, and that pretending not to see makes one complicit in another's pain. After Abena, other voices rose. Small acts of resistance appeared in different homes. Her example not only freed her own life, but lit a flame in many others, still hidden in the shadows of fear. And so when the women of the village spoke about what happened, they always repeated the same phrase. It was when she said, "Not my son," that true strength was born in that house. That phrase became almost a proverb remembered in circles of conversation on full moon nights in stories told to children. For it spoke not only of Abena's pain, but of the strength that can exist in every woman, every mother, every human being who decides not to remain silent before injustice. But in the end, the story of Abena and Kofi was not about blows, nor about falls, but about the courage to break silence, about truth that even suffocated always finds a way to come to light, and about the certainty that justice, though delayed, always comes to those who stand firm in dignity. That story echoed through generations, not as lament Buddha's testimony, because where there is imposed silence, there will also be a voice ready to break it. Where there is hidden pain, there will also be courage waiting to be born. And where there is injustice, sooner or later, truth will come to the surface, just as it did in the lives of Abena and Kofi, turning shame into dignity, fear into strength, and silence into liberation. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one.